Good morning. I'm Karen Estlund. I'm the Associate Dean at Penn State University. I'm the co-chair of our newspaper community group, and I'm also looking for the clicker. Where is it? Is it this? Oh, excellent, thank you. Great. And I'm a member of the coordinating committee. So I'm very happy to be here at the Library of Congress today. I started working on digital newspapers with the Library of Congress, I think back in 2005 or 2006 with the National Digital Newspaper Program. So it kind of feels like coming home being here today. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different take and talk about why and the connections that we can make with IIIF. So why newspapers to begin with? So newspapers are widely available across the world. The exciting thing about mass media is it really is mass. So we have a lot of content that is already openly available that we can share. And just a smattering of looking at some of this, you can see here's a thing on bicycles from the Library of Congress. Maybe we want to see it from the European Library. We're going to look at more bicycles in Singapore. Oh, and how about Australia? All of these things are great around the world, but as both Tom and Ben have mentioned, they're siloed. And in addition, we have these local collections. So people have been digitizing newspapers for quite some time, much to the microfilm sickness problems that Ben alluded to, and also the quick digitization. And this is where IIIF, I think, is going to be so important for allowing these connections and dialogue. So some of these local collections have extremely important things. Like here is a newspaper that was founded shortly after the Constitution was enacted in the United States. And this particular issue gives synopsis of what's going on in the states right now and why you need this method of communication. We also have newspapers that show some of our darkest times. So this particular paper is from a Japanese internment camp that was penned by the detainees there, and it needs to be shared, and we need to have conversations about this today. Similarly, we can look at some of our papers. We often talk in the historic sense, but this is a contemporary newspaper from the Confederated Tribe of the Grand Ronde. It's a paper that they produce themselves, and they do all of the work to get it into our digital collections, but again, we need to link this with the larger dialogue. So newspapers, obviously I love newspapers. I've been working with them for a long time, but so do our users. We know that newspapers are going to give us probably more views than any of our digital collections. People love them. The mass media is there. They can be used for many interdisciplinary types of study. I will say one of my favorite when I was working at the University of Utah was the study of soy and people who wanted to see historically how soy was grown, and it directly affected the economy of the state. So why IIIF for newspapers? You have seen lots of the fun things that we can do. We can zoom and pan, and I'm not going to do any animations. You've seen plenty of those. And this is an old standby. Many newspaper sites had front ends where simply you did not have the plugin to see the content. And as you've seen now with IIIF, you can use multiple viewers. You can get the images in any way you need. By the way, I cannot tell you how many times people have raised their hand to tell me my slide is broken. So I really appreciate in this audience that nobody has stopped me at this point in time. And as we look at the newspapers are an excellent example, of course, of you have an image and you have text painted on that image. So turning OCR and other annotations into different kind of web annotations so that you can play with them, search them, etc., of course, is all great. Here is a wonderful example of how IIIF maps to newspapers that came out of the community group, and just a quick showing that, an article becomes a range, the OCR and alto text turns into annotation, so it's a pretty smooth transition. So all of that is well and good, right? But why are we doing this? So this is a newspaper from a Finnish community in a small town in Oregon. It was one of the first women-produced newspapers that we have, and this community They were exiled from Finland in the early 20th century. The National Library of Finland has also digitized all their newspapers and are currently working on IIIF. So all of a sudden, we will be able to connect these communities together and figure out what the social movement of the time was. Similarly, here is a sample of looking at the spread of English in Wales. I found this by searching a small town Scranton, Pennsylvania newspaper that was very excited about talking about English poetry that was going to come out of Wales, and then looking at the same time period at the National Library of Wales, figuring out how they were doing as part of their education and reading series. And you can see one of the things they say is that with newspapers, in Wales, more than any other country in the world, they have a literate community. I'm sorry, it's at the wrong angle, but anyway, it's very interesting. And one of my favorite examples, also from the National Library of Wales and a newspaper in Salt Lake City, is comparing how corsets were viewed over time. You can see that they were a little bit more progressive in Wales and outlawed corsets and said you should really not use these about 100 years before they were talking about promoting them in Utah. And we all know, as much as history and fashion is political, and if we can cut oxygen out of half of the population, we get to determine who speaks. Here's another favorite example that I like to show about the context and, again, the connections that you can use with IIIF. This paper is the Klamath Tribune. The Klamath tribes in Oregon asked us to digitize this paper. It was created precisely for the assimilation of the tribe into the US in the 1950s. To date, nobody will claim ownership over this paper. So it was a government-produced paper that it is a true orphan works, as people have said. I don't even want to recognize it. So it was very important for the tribe to have it available. It was important to have the discussion in the contextual materials. So by having and in this case, there's actually a blog, an article site, they can embed the IIIF images and discuss the importance of this paper. And this is extremely important. When I used to teach this to students, they would read this paper and say, oh, look at, the tribe is so happy. They're planting these plants and they're doing this, they're reading in this school. And they didn't have that context that actually this was a paper about assimilation. And so being able to have that tribal commentary is an essential piece of our history and how we think about how IIIF can help serve our users. Here's another example. We have mentioned a couple times that IIIF is mapping text to annotations. So in this example, I was working with a course, and the students were looking at historic newspapers in Pennsylvania and how the police was represented. Using tools like Mirador, they were able to use the annotations, which then become web annotations. And currently, that is transitioning, for those in the audience, from open annotations to web annotations from the W3C. This is extremely important because that is the same standard that we use with often looking at tools to edit web pages. So you can look at a modern Pittsburgh web page in HTML, and you can use annotation tools, and they are encoded the same way that we're looking at our historic paper, and so that creates the dialogue across as well. So I wanted to promote the IIIF community group a little bit more here too. The community group is really all about promoting best practices. How do we get our newspapers in the state so that we can have the dialogue? What do we need? And by asking all of the questions that we've been talking about today. So one of the main things that we are looking at is how are we providing relationships between the OCR and the images? What does that look like? If you have a viewer with a date, how do you do that, etc. So in 2017-2018, we finished our best practices guidelines. We've been working very heavily with the text granularity group on figuring out what level of text you want to pull back, coordinating with the Alto board, etc., and working very closely with vendors, the newspapers. Exciting things that are coming up in 2018-2019, we are working on updating those recommendations and the best practices so that we can be consistent with 3.0. And then you've heard a lot about machine learning. So we're also working with a university in France that is taking the images and the OCR text, and what they're trying to do is improve the OCR quality, which for many of us with newspapers that sometimes have a 20% OCR accuracy, this is a really important access question, and it's great that we can experiment as part of that. So I actually want to end today in Washington, D.C. by citing from that first article that I showed from the Gazette of the United States after the Constitution, because I think, again, we need to re-emphasize why we are doing this. The technology is fun, the tools are great, but why are we doing this? So I'm going to read just the front and last part of this. At this important crisis, the ideas that fill the mind are pregnant with events of the greatest magnitude. And then at the bottom, hence the propriety of increasing the medium of knowledge and information. And that is what we're doing here today. Thank you.